Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Parcher. I am the Executive Director of the President Woodrow Wilson House. We are a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here, welcome you back to be at the museum for this very important talk this evening. Joel and I know each other. We were talking last summer about his job and his career, and we started asking him questions about the movie or the television show, The Diplomat. And yes, everybody's shaking their head. Karen was there, and my husband and Joel, we were talking about it. And we said, look, is that really true? Did that really happen? Is that the way it should be? And you know, he's saying, oh, no, behind the scenes it goes like this. And he just brought us in. And we thought, we should start doing talks here in Washington, D.C., in the Kalorama neighborhood, with diplomats and hear their stories about their experiences. And so tonight is the beginning of what we are calling Dip Chat. So tonight's the first of our Dip Chats as well. Yay! I will introduce Joel, and then we'll take it from there. Joel was appointed on February 21st in 2018 to be the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the United States of America to the Gabonese Republic and to the Democratic Republic of São Tomé and Príncipe. He retired from the Foreign Service in January 2020. He joined the Foreign Service in 1987 and was assigned as the General Services Officer to the U.S. Embassy in Sanaa, Yemen. He was then assigned to the embassy in Paris, France, where he served first as staff assistant to the ambassador and later as vice consul. He returned to Washington, D.C. and served in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs as staff assistant and from 1992 to 1993 as a legislative management officer. He served then as the Press and Public Affairs Officer to the President's Special Representative on Haiti, followed by an assignment as Columbia Desk Officer in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, and then for 2 years as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. In 1998, he was assigned to Belize as Management Officer. You can see he has really been around the world, and we're only halfway done. He served as Human Rights Officer in the U.S. Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and from 2004 to 2005 as the Political Counselor. He returned to Washington in 2005 as Post-Management Officer in the Executive Office of the European and International Organizations Bureaus, followed by an assignment in the Oval and Undersecretary for Management Innovation Division. He was assigned to Embassy Kabul, Afghanistan, as Deputy Director of INL. He returned to Washington in 2010 as Deputy Special Coordinator for Haiti, and in 2013 assumed the Chief of Staff position for the Bureau of Administration. In 2016, he began serving as the Associate Dean of the Foreign Institute's School of Professional and Area Studies. He is originally born in Haiti and grew up in New York and in Baltimore, Maryland. He received his MA from the National War College and a BA from the University of Maryland. He speaks French, Haitian Creole, and some Arabic, and he and his wife Karen have 2 children. And Karen's here tonight, so thank you, Karen. And thank you, Ambassador, for for starting our Dip Chats. So with that, I introduce Ambassador Joel Damies.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I just want to say one thing about The Diplomat, the show. You would never find Ambassador Collins and Dr. Collins fighting in the yard of Spossel House, as has been portrayed. So that's one thing I can tell you is not true. I also have to very much shorten that. But really, you're here to hear Dr. Collins, so I'm just gonna say some brief remarks about her and then cede the dais, so that you can have the benefit of hearing a lot about these wonderful experiences that the Collins have had, and in this particular case, the Soviet Union and Russia. So our speaker is Dr. Naomi Collins, a writer and consultant to cultural and higher education organizations, who has served as executive director and before that, chair of the Maryland Humanities Council, the Maryland affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and executive director of NAFSA, Association of International Educators. Dr. Collins has served and serves on the board and executive committee of the Arts and Humanities Council, the Literacy Council of Montgomery County, the Writers Center, and the Bethesda Metro Area Village. A member of Phi Beta Kappa and Phi Alpha Theta, she holds a PhD in history from Indiana University. Born and raised in Brooklyn and Queens, we have something in that New York thing, and the pizza, well, anyway. Born and raised in Brooklyn and Queens and a resident of Bethesda, she has lived, worked, and traveled in Turkey, Jordan, Israel, Mexico, Canada, Germany, China, Central Asia, England, and Europe, in addition to the intervals lived in Russia, of course. She has published the book, Through Dark Days and White Nights, 4 Decades Observing a Changing Russia, followed by almost 40 book talks. There is also edited transcripts of all interviews of her life will soon be posted at the Library of Congress website, although tonight you get the real live person, so you won't have to make the trek to the library. Dr. Collins is joined by her husband, Ambassador Jim Collins, a retired career member of the U.S. Foreign Service, who served as U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001. Prior to that assignment, he held positions as Ambassador at Large and Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for the new independent states, and as Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires at the American Embassy, Moscow, from 1990 to 1993. In addition to 3 diplomatic postings in Moscow, he also served in Amman, Jordan, Izmir, Turkey, held positions in the European and Near East bureaus, and the executive offices at the Department of State, as well as the National Security Council staff at the White House. Following this presentation by Dr. Collins, we will invite you to participate in a question and answer segment in which Ambassador Collins will also be available to elaborate on aspects of their shared history in the Soviet Union and Russia, as well as their perceptions of current events in the region. The Woodrow Wilson House would very much like to recognize and thank Dr. Christopher Unger for the introduction to Dr. and Ambassador Collins and for making this evening's event possible. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Naomi Collins.
Thank you for the introduction that was also probably longer than it needs to be, but it's good to see you all. I'm glad first to see familiar faces and new ones. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. And good, this is good, because I don't always have a strong voice. I also see a mix of backgrounds here. I'm sure some of you have traveled a lot and some of you maybe a bit less, so that can come up during our discussion as well. But I think that one thing that we all know is that Russia never disappears from the news. I've been saying this for decades, and each time I think next time I'll be proved wrong, but I haven't been yet. And this has gone on for decades as the news of Russia moves from the front page to the business section, to the arts section, and then back to the front page again. And that's for those of us old enough to read newspapers, I should say. I realize younger people may not see it hopping all over the newspapers. And of course, there's been a lot of dramatic change there over the decades, and a lot of things that are obviously continuous. I used to think that the end of the Soviet Union in 1991 was hopeful and heralded a period of change. But as we gather, it's clear now that nothing cheering is really going on there, and it's not clear where that hopefulness might come from moving forward. While history does not repeat itself, anybody in the field of history knows that, I do sometimes feel now the chill I wrote about experiencing in the 1960s when we first lived in Moscow, in the dormitories of Moscow State University, MGU, when we arrived as graduate students in 1965. And I know there's at least one person in the audience who can identify with that, who was there with us through some of that time. The feeling of isolation from the rest of the world, the sense of being in a place sealed off completely from the rest of the world, the secrecy, the repression, the fear, the intrusion by authorities. It was a kind of darkness, and it affected everything, I thought. And we returned to live there at intervals over the next 4+ decades. I have to say, each time I went back, I thought, really, again? And all without taking to drink. Not too much. One thing I noticed early about going to Russia each time, from the time we were students until we went later, were the distinctive aromas of the place, the distinctive smells. I think all places have that. But these just stayed in my mind so much longer than a lot of other things did. The remembrances, as the remembrances faded, I'll read you what I wrote specifically about going and coming to and from Moscow. The distinctive smells of the city, of the corridors, kitchens, streets, and metros remained decade after decade. On each return, they triggered recollections and a sense of place far more quickly than the sight of the Cyrillic alphabet and sounds of the Russian language. These were hardly the aromas of Proust's remembrances of his childhood, the sweet little cakes and mother's perfume. The kitchen reeked of foods. This was a shared kitchen in the dormitories. The kitchen had reeked of foods cleaned in the sink, boiled on the stove, left on the table, trashed. Onions, cabbage, sometimes beef, fish skins, scales, and guts left in the sink. Foods in the kitchen, as in the food shop, sat at room temperature without refrigeration. They became pungent in their distinctive types, exaggerated reminders of milks, cheeses, meats, fish, and vegetables. And that stayed for a long time. I think with more refrigeration now, some of this has changed. I thought in writing the book, and when I thought about writing after all the decades being there, I thought it might be interesting to write not as a historian or to write about government, because a lot of people had already done that. And I did enough research to know that nobody had written a book, or has since, no American, covering 4 decades of observing Russia. I checked with the librarians at the Library of Congress. I spent some time bothering them. So I thought it would be useful to write about what it felt like to live there at these intervals, being in Soviet Russia in the 1960s and 70s, and then in post-Soviet and Russian major transformations of the 1990s and into the beginning of the 21st century. So over these decades, I took to writing. First on a manual typewriter, that some of you remember. Then, after that, on an electric typewriter. Yeah, please come in and sit down. Yes. And finally, of course, to word processing. I think, as you probably all realize too, what a difference it makes when you can do word processing instead of typing with carbon copies or a we did something a little bit illicit. I get Jim to go into the mimeograph room and I cut these stencils of what I wrote in Healy. In the middle of the night when nobody was looking. So I decided not to write a traditional history, as I mentioned, or even an account of government, but just observations and reflection of what it felt like living there, what it seemed to be like for Russians, and what it felt like living there as an American. living there over those decades, and as I was writing much more recently in the 21st century, another funny thing happened. I got older. Now this happens to all of us, but I'm not sure how much we think about how much it changes our observations of the world. Not only did I change perspectives and roles from being a graduate student to being ultimately the wife of the ambassador without changing husbands, but also generations shifted for me. When we left for Russia in 1965, I thought of my grandmother every time I saw an old woman, a babushka, shoveling snow in the below zero winter cold, or scrubbing walls and floors of the metro train platforms, or the ones I saw in the rural countryside washing clothes in a local stream when it was below freezing. I mean, the water was moving so it didn't freeze, but the hands were bright red. I have a photo to prove this. Because nobody's going to believe this, I think, otherwise. Well, then, of course, what I saw started changing with the decades as well as I got older. While our story began with our journey into Russia by train in 1965, and that's where this podcast begins, I'll mention that later too. The book itself opens with the dramatic experience of being there for the attempted coup in 1991. In structuring the book, it seemed like a much more dramatic opening than a lot of other things could have been. What it felt like to be witnessing it up close and personal with Jim in charge of all the Americans in Russia. He was the charge. There was no ambassador at the time. And I wondered about my fate and Jim's as the tanks rolled by right outside our windows. Big glass windows, no protection, a wall only yay high, so I could have climbed the wall. And wondering what would be next. I'll turn to that later. Instead, I'll read you a passage not about the coup attempt, but something more in line with what you're all here about too, is diplomatic life. This is in the middle of this is in 1993 now, but this is about a state dinner, and I realize it jumps from the coup attempt a bit forward to 1993. And it was New Year's Eve in 1992, and then New Year's Day 1993, when we learned suddenly that there was going to be a summit between President H.W. Bush and President Yeltsin, to be held 2 days later, unexpectedly rerouted, and would land unplanned for in Moscow. It had, because of the winter weather and other such dramatic things in January, it had to be moved to larger airports. Okay, so suddenly everybody goes into high gear, planning all of this. We got a call saying the president and his wife would be staying at Spaso House, which had no bedding, sheets, towels, because there was no ambassador. There was nothing in the house. Could they have some of our sheets and towels? Because the president of the United States and his wife would be using a bed and, things like that. So they ran over, they took our bedding over there to use at the same time. People were running around doing the jobs that embassies do, and of course I was not involved in that because I was not working for the embassy. But what I did remember, and I'll never forget, is the state dinner. And you know how that works, one dinner hosted by each side. Saturday night's state dinner was held at the Granovitaya Palace, the faceted palace within the Kremlin walls. Those who have been in Russia know that inside the Kremlin are so many palaces, churches, and other buildings. It's not just one place. It was a 15th century hall we were sitting in. It was the hall of the Parliament of Noblemen, the Russian House of Lords, you might say, the Boyar Duma in Russian. That's where they had met in the 15th century. During dinner, President Bush and President Yeltsin, at separate times, caught my eye across the room and lifted their glass in a toast. And I'm sitting there and thinking, is this real? Can this be real? Jim was at the head table and so forth, as you'd expect as well. I thought you might be interested in the courses though. That's what people always like about Diplomat. Like, what did they eat at those events? The courses included cold smoked fishes first, then pate, vegetable soup, then a dish with hot fish and potatoes, which I was hoping was the main course, but then it was followed by another dish with meat and vegetables. And then all that was topped with vanilla ice cream embedded with red cherries, little pastries and coffee, and appropriate wines and champagnes for each course. There was a lot of entertainment. You would guess that, wouldn't you? Dancers, singers, musicians, wonderful performance. But beyond the food and drink, the music and dance, the power and history I was witnessing, I was haunted by the vision of Ivan the Terrible murdering his own son in that very room. I imagined the floor under my feet, absorbing the blood and the wall sustaining echoes of their last cries. A mixed experience. The book ends with some reflections, but before that I will mention the podcast. Very recently I was contacted by a young historian in Portugal who had read the book 3 times and was very interested in travel accounts of all kinds. Being in Portugal, this is not surprising, starting in 1500. He somehow managed to reach me through internet research, my university, and so forth, and in the 6-month period produced a podcast of the book. He excerpted the parts that he thought were interesting. He did it all in English, I might say, and he narrates it in English. It's a YouTube, and we left some papers, some little flyers outside for anyone who would like to check on it, although the easiest way is just Google my name, YouTube, Russia, and it tends to come up that way too. And it also references what you pointed out, the oral histories that were done of Jim and me by an affiliate of the State Department that gets into some of these stories, particularly those who really want to get into the diplomacy that Jim did during those times. But after writing for quite a while, I decided that I needed to come to some conclusions. What did I conclude with observing Russia after 4 decades? And I realized that the most obvious thing was how different it was to experience history from studying it, for many reasons. First, I realized this is how history happens. When you're living through it, you can't turn to the last page and see how things turn out, which tends to affect your thinking about the entire event. If you think about the American Civil War, you can't think about it without knowing how it ended up. And in fact, at the time things are happening, you don't even know what is happening at that time. It's a mystery while it's happening. Second, it didn't seem as if there were abstract forces of history at work, but actual people making actual choices in real time. It took a lot of people. Third, I realized you can't predict what's coming. No one had predicted the end of the Soviet Union at that time in that way, even though many of them today will tell you they did. And there were many people who claimed afterwards, I knew it was going to end, but did you know it was going to end right then and in that way? Not as far as we can tell. 4, I discovered that one charming muse of history is serendipity. The coup leaders, the leaders of the coup attempt, not capturing Yeltsin at the beginning of the coup. They could have done. The Russians in the CNN satellite tower not obeying orders to stop broadcasting. They could have done, but they didn't, and we have documentary evidence of all of this as a result. Other chance events, many chance events, many of them depending on strong individuals too. And finally, I learned that it's easier to believe a movie when it imitates reality than reality when it imitates a movie. So it's sure easier to predict the past than it is to predict the future. But we will pick up now with a few comments by Jim about how he saw things as we departed from Russia and when he left the Foreign Service, and what he's thinking about the situation at that time, and picking up from there what's on your mind, questions, comments, and so forth. So we'll look forward to that too. So I thank you, and now Jim will have the chance to make his own comments.
Well, I do urge you to read Naomi's book. It is unique. It provides insight into a sort of personal take on what life really is like day to day in a country which is very different from what we know today or what we knew even at that time. But there's one thing I would say that's very important. This is pre-digital age we're talking about. We made in the time we were graduate students, we made one phone call back to the United States. And what you did then was go down to the equivalent of the head of AT&T in Moscow, book your call for 3 weeks ahead, and you got 15 minutes, which you came down to wait in the waiting room to have, and then into a booth where probably 2 or 3 other people were listening as well. And I talked to my parents. So I mean, this was a very different kind of world. But I wanted simply to say a word about something that I'm sure is on people's mind. Who is Putin? What in the hell is going on? And I have not been there to know Putin since 2001 or work with him. But I did work with him for 1.5 years. And I knew him for a couple of years before that. And here's what I would say to you about him. He's smart. He is quite ruthless. He is clever. But above all, he is determined, as he said, and he literally used these words in when he became acting president in 2000, New Year's Day. He was going to make Russia great again. And I do not say that in jest. It's what he said he would do. And I would submit to you that the pattern he had in front of him was the greatness in Russia was essentially to restore Russia to the place where, with America, we were the 2 superpowers. And we basically made the decisions about where the world was going to go. Now, there was a degree of naivete on both our sides about that. But at the time, this did not seem unreasonable. And so he was picking up from a decade in the 1990s of chaos and the total upheaval and turning on its head of everything that every generation living in Russia in the time Naomi describes had known. The communist system was gone. Russia had borders it never had before. It had neighbors now that had been subject provinces. It was basically sort of European, but not really. What was it going to be? And the 90s tore up the old, but it left unanswered the question about what was the new. And it was into that vacuum, in a way, that you dropped this rather short, but very intelligent man, Vladimir Putin. And I think it's interesting about 3 things about First, I think he believed that the future was possible in a sense the way the past had been in terms of Russia's role as an international leader. It was possible it could be like the United States. We would sort of get together, we would decide on our respective objectives, and then those others would have to follow. Naive perhaps, but I think that's what he thought. Second, he thought that Russia was entitled to this role. It was the role that had been destined for it from time immemorial. And third, it was a European power. And I remember he told Secretary of State when she visited, well, I like Chinese food, and I do karate, but that's not who we are. We're Europeans. Now, when you put that against today, you have to say what happened. And I will simply submit to you that one of the basic things that happened is that he couldn't make these things come about. From the United States' point of view, we really didn't accept Russia as an equal power or a great power. We thought they had lost, and they should behave like it. But they didn't. He believed that Russia essentially should share in the decision-making of the future of what we might call the Euro-Atlantic world. We didn't believe that. And I can tell you, when I came back, I was told, no, Russia is yesterday's news. We have a different agenda. And it's quite extraordinary if you look at the effort Putin made to try to make his point. When he came after 9/11, he was the first leader to come, the first leader to call Bush. And he signed certain documents in Texas that nobody bothers to read, but in fact, they were a statement that I am ready to pursue exactly what you all wanted Yeltsin to do in the 90s, in transforming the society and remaking this Eurasian world. But I need to be part of the decision-making for the future. And what he got for it was that we withdrew from the ABM Treaty, which was the core of the stability for the nuclear balance, 6 months after he left, and basically ignored it. So I think there's a reality here that we face that for 2-3 decades, he had a vision which he could not achieve, and so he's now working on it in a very different way. Now, I happen to say, I'll close with this one. I think it's one hell of a job to convince the Russian people that China is your friend. And I don't think that's going to work. But for the moment, that is the way he sees his opportunities. So I just going to leave it there, and we can go ahead and do questions.
So now, yeah. So now it's the floor is yours. And the role that I play here is to make sure that everyone who would like to participate, who has a question, gets a chance to have this discussion with the Commons. I would say that what I find really special about this experience is the idea that we are able to get the real context of what the Russian people are thinking, who are they, and how does this tie into, as Ambassador Collins was just explaining, to what's going on today. So please feel free, and I see we have a, please go ahead. Yeah, let me do this.
Naomi and Jim, thank you very much. I'm nostalgic because I was in Moscow as Foreign Service before that. Jim, picking up on your last point about Putin's vision being dashed during the Bush years, would you say that the Cheney-Bush policy towards him, dismissing him, sent him in the direction that he's going today? I mean, was that a breaking point? Do you think it would have been different if we responded differently at that time? I know that's hard, it's hard to.
Well, first, let me just say, I don't think it's just Bush as Junior that we're talking about. I think, in fact, in the 90s, under Clinton as well, decisions were made that already pointed us in a direction that, in fact, was simply amplified once Putin came into office. But I think it's probably not correct to assume that Mr. Putin would have been a Jeffersonian Democrat. I just don't believe that. I think, however, there were questions that, I do believe that we did not explore as much as we might have what would have been possible to create a new arrangement to take the place of what disappeared when, if you will, the old Soviet-American arrangement disappeared. We had a chance to have one Euro-Atlantic world, and frankly, that just wasn't in the cards. What we had in mind was we were going to expand our view of what the security arrangement will be, and it's Russia's not to stand in the way.
Why don't you just stand up, Naomi? I think this room is big enough to.
I have two very different kinds of questions.
We'll ask one.
The first is, do you think the Grand Inquisitor was about the Russian character or about human nature? It's something that I've always wondered. The second thing is, given Putin's inability to gain another inch in Ukraine, but he has said Poland is next, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he wanted to reestablish not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire, which means he wants Alaska back. What happens when he realizes he can't do that?
For just a small question, I actually thought that Dostoevsky was thinking of the Russian character in that, and I actually quoted in that passage in the book about that. But I'm not a literature major, I'm a history major, so what can I say?
Well, I mean, my sense is, again, that Russian aspirations, if you will, Putin's aspiration is essentially to be taken as a serious member of the team that's at the table making the decisions. Now, I think he probably is realistic enough to know that he is not in a position to wage a war against Europe. I mean, there's nobody's going to win this. And even if you take away the nuclear dimension, the Russians are so outnumbered at the moment that this would not be a very wise thing to do. Now, we already know he didn't do so well.
How wise was it to go into Ukraine?
So, I mean, I think, there's a degree of bluster and there's a degree of trying to create a degree of uncertainty amongst all those who are standing up against you. But I think the reality is he's a very cold-blooded, very calculating gentleman. And he knows, I think today, a lot better than he did 2 years ago, the limits of his power. So I don't put too much on it. But I do think there is no question that what is driving him in many respects is the idea to show that Russia is going to be a major voice and player in the global order. And you're not going to ignore them. And he keeps looking around for ways to do this. And having given up, in essence, on the the Western option, if you will, because we won't play. He's now playing with China, and he's doing the multiple state idea, and so on and so on. And without, I would say with some success.
Dr. Collins, I'm just really interested, you alluded in your speech about the changes in the Russian character between the 60s and when you left. And I'm really curious about what you saw remained and what you saw changed over that time through all this crazy history.
That's a very difficult question, really, the one about character, I mean. A lot of things changed in appearance, of course. And a lot of things change when generations change. The expectations in this country and in that country of younger people is always incredibly different from that of their parents. The young people, like those in this country, have no history in their head, and their parents' world means nothing. And some of them, I think, even look back fondly thinking, well, those were very comfortable times, which they were not. I just watched a YouTube yesterday, in fact, about that. It's a Russian emigre who keeps hearing from people, those were the good old days, and young people who think so, who had not been there then. I'm not sure that it's fair to generalize about character, but a lot of the other things, of course, have changed enormously when things opened up. I think what is sad for me is that when things were so open and people were so, what shall I say, having the opportunity to become so worldly, and then now, you know, with less ability to do that, I don't think that's great. Are they suffering? Well, I think the big question for today that I can't answer actually is whether today people, young people, are living the life of Riley, as we used to say, and just enjoying themselves as if, you know, the war in Ukraine wasn't happening or not. I don't know if anybody in America has a really good read on what's happening on the streets and how much people are affected in their daily life. We hear from different people, and our sense so far is that perhaps the impact isn't so great on daily life as some of us might be thinking it could be, you know, too. Does character change? I think each generation changes. And once you have a whole generation that's brought up with new media there and here, you're dealing with just a different universe, a different way that people think about relationships, about everything really in their lives. So I know it sounds like evading the question, but it's a hard one to know.
Let me just make one comment. I think there's no question that in 30 years, there has been a real transformation for almost all Russians in one very basic way, and that is that they know there's another world out there, and they know a lot about it.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, you just cannot imagine how isolated the Russian society was from the outside world, and how effective until maybe the mid to late 80s. The communist system was in creating a completely separate, segregated society, which had which taught its people a certain way of thinking that was universal inside and unchallenged by any sort of reality from the outside. So, I mean, you know, every book started with some damn quote from Lenin or Marx. And people didn't necessarily believe what they read in Pravda, but they did think about the dynamics of society the way Marxists and the communist system more or less taught them. Now that ended when suddenly, I mean, you know, the whole world dumps on them. I mean, we gave, I believe until the 80s, we were giving about 4,000 visas at the embassy for Russians to go to the United States. By the end of the 90s, we were doing several hundred thousand. And I mean, mean, so the country was open, and that has had a lasting effect. I don't think you can do away with it, but Putin's trying. He's trying to rewrite the history books and so forth. But I don't think it's gonna work.
Want me to ask something, or should I?
Maybe we should get a different.
Yeah, question? I'll come to you next.
So,
Yeah.
you first went to Russia on an exchange program,
Right.
and so, I went too, and maybe some other people in the room. But all of these exchanges, all of the cultural programs, everything is gone. And this was part of your life professionally, of supporting this intellectual exchange.
Sure.
What do you think is, when we're just talking now about, or you were just talking now, about greater Russian exposure to the outside world.
Right.
This part is gone. And what do you think is the consequence of this, and what is the chance of rebuilding it?
That's a very, very good question. I think Jim will pick up on some of it because he's now working with some of those exchanges too. It works in two different ways though. There was a whole period in which exchanges were the major ways in which people came to know one another. And it still would be true, and of course we're doing study abroad and foreign students from other places today in a big way, well, COVID and all that, but in a big way too. But now that once things started opening up, there was much more free travel anyway. It wasn't structured exchange, but people were getting on airplanes for the first time, and traveling at least in Europe and so forth, which I think made some difference too. But Jim is actually responsible now for some large organizations that started out doing that until first COVID and then Putin came along. So I don't know if you want to comment because of the exchanges that well, not exactly.
Well, I mean, I think, again, I think you cannot underestimate the impact of the digital age.
Yeah, in regard to this.
I mean, I don't care what Putin does, he cannot shut off the country from the
Right.
outside world.
Right.
And in that sense, I think the, if you will, totalitarian state is over.
No.
Now, that doesn't mean you can't arrange it in new ways or do different things, but you can't do it the old way. So exchanges, first of all, in the sense that we knew them, where any kind of contact was odd.
Right.
Remember that when we went as exchanges, there were exactly 18 American students in the whole Soviet Union.
We were too
So,
up there.
so, I mean, this was, we were a real oddball. And the Russians going to the United States were similarly really oddballs. Well, that kind of thing is gone forever, it seems to me. I mean, the digital age has changed it completely. So it's going to be a different question, really. I think that now it's a question of whether or not there's any way that we can manage to define enough common norms of engagement to make things work that will determine who is closer, who is more distant, who is hostile, who is reasonably friendly, and so on. It won't be a question of not knowing anything about the other guy.
Something you want to add, or?
No, I think there
We're
was one,
right
two,
in the
three.
back, and then,
Oh, hi. Oh, should I stand?
please,
Yes.
if you can
Okay,
stand up.
I don't like public speaking, but, given just, going back to your earlier point of just how the world has been opened up and everything, and given there is a younger generation and the whole outcry with not a lot of Russians agreeing with the Ukraine war and Putin's actions, do you ever see in the foreseeable future a Russia without Putin?
Well, it's not immoral. So, I mean, the reality is, yes, there will be a Russia without Putin, but I can't tell you what kind of Russia it's necessarily going to be just because it doesn't have Putin.
Yeah, that's the real question.
Well, but to her point,
Yeah.
will the Putin effect
Exactly.
continue beyond him?
Beyond the man.
Or do you think that it's a non-sustainable
Right.
situation that he has set.
That's the important question.
Well,
Yeah.
There's no succession plan.
That's,
Yeah.
that nobody knows.
Well, look, I think the question in part will depend on outsiders. In other words, what are we going to do? Are we going to say that, oh, we agree that the Russian Eurasian family has to be part of the global system, and we're gonna have to work with them one way or another? Doesn't mean we have to like them or agree all the time, but we're gonna have to deal with it. Or are we gonna continue to try to isolate them and see them as the enemy? That will have an effect. Do I think you're going to have another transformation like we did in the 90s in Russia anytime soon? No, I don't, frankly. I mean, I think they have created their own market economy. They have created their own non-imperial system, if you will, in the sense that it's not the Russian Empire anymore. They've created their own modernizing capacity to manipulate the digital world and so forth. So, I mean, they're gonna be around. But I come back to my final point. You've got a big problem to convince the Russians that China's their friend. But I would submit that the real problem that Russia faces in going forward, the biggest problem, is they have 30 million people in 8 time zones east of the Urals. There's nobody home. And in one province south of Khabarovsk, there are 100 million Chinese. Now, what they're going to do about that in the long run is going to determine what Russia really is.
And about formal questions.
Yes, we're gonna go to this young lady and we'll come to you.
So, regardless of presently, do you believe that Russia earned, deserved, not being part of the big boy table, as it were?
I think that's.
That's yours. But
Yeah.
how do the Russian people see it? I mean, we know the political aspect of it, but from your experiences, how do the Russian people think that they don't belong at the big boy table?
Well, that's a good question too. I mean, I'm not sure how much the Russian people think a lot about that, you know, or
Isn't it really a fairly top-heavy kind of, shall we say, management of a nation? It's not like this one with the voice of every single person who has a view on every single topic. But I think at the higher political level, I think you ask a good question too. Were there reasons that people felt that Russia should not be at the table? And I wasn't, you know, at those diplomatic tables to know, but that I think is a very interesting question too. Now, of course, we see the consequences on all sides of that, but it's a hard one. I don't know if you think that there were things that, well, I guess Jim talked about things that might have been done differently that might have led to different outcomes, but that, you know, all of that always gets into that hypothetical about, you know, what if, and that's always hard in history to know. And even in looking back, I'm not really sure about being at the table. Deserve in the sense that they are a superpower and another nuclear power, that's, you know, that elevates them to a level of, what shall I say, some sort of equity at the table too, probably. Equal danger possibility. You had something.
They have a veto.
And they have a veto.
Security Council.
And the Security Council, that's right.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you very much for quite a fascinating discussion. I think we've all learned a lot. I'd like to pivot over to another world leader who's also on the headlines nearly every morning when we open the newspapers, Mr. Zelensky. So how do you view his ability to maintain strong relationships with the West and NATO moving into 2024? And what could the world look like with a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency vis-a-vis Zelensky's relationships with those organizations?
that's a big one.
Yes. 30 seconds.
Yeah, that may be a topic for a whole other.
Well, look, I mean, I think the great unanswered question, frankly, and by the way, it's the same in Russia, in a sense, is we have two leaders who are now war leaders. They are where they are, and their persona politically and in almost every other way is tied with their ability to conduct successful military action. Now, you know, and the problem is, both of them have announced that I will give up nothing. Nothing can be compromised, right? Zelensky, not 1 inch of Ukrainian territory. Putin has just kept reiterating, not 1 inch of everything we've occupied. Well, that doesn't give you a hell of a lot of room to negotiate. And the problem I see for both, but for Zelensky in particular, given the history of Ukraine politics, is if he has to sit down and begin to talk about compromise in order to get a peace, I'm not sure whether the coalition behind him and the strength he has will survive. I would like to think it would, but I'm not convinced. I also think that Mr. Putin is probably somewhat worried in the same way. He has cost thousands of lives, disrupted the entire system in his country for a stupid adventure. And you know, if he were to go home and say, well, that was all a mistake, I don't think that would come down very well either. So, I mean, I think we're in a really nasty situation where neither one of the leaders sees an easy way to talk about how you end this. Now, that means, seems to me, that we on the outside are gonna have to do some thinking for them, probably.
And NATO.
And that may be NATO and the United States and China and so forth, because I don't see a way that it does much more than just stall right now.
Leave it to
So, I mean, I don't know whether that answers your question. but
We are getting short on time, but we have 2 questions right here and a third one, and then I think we'll have to end.
And with me.
Oh, all right, well, we'll make you the last one. So please.
We're good on time. Joe, we're good on time.
We are?
Yeah, we're at 7:30. Okay.
So with that in mind, my question is, you talk about, well, first, when you say that they're not really negotiating and they're not, neither did Woodrow Wilson, he didn't give it on anything, so. But this is a quote of Woodrow Wilson's, which is only peace between equals can last. Is Russia our equal? Is Russia the Ukraine's equal? And China, where does this fit into being equals and can peace last?
What does equal mean?
Yeah, what does
Equal
equal
what
mean?
way?
In the nuclear age, it means something different from what it meant in Mr. Wilson's time. That I would say number 1, because nobody can win.
Equal capacity to kill.
So the equal capacity to destroy each other is there. And I think the real question, you know, we have in front of us is whether or not the United States, number 1, which has never yet lived in a world in which we couldn't legitimately say we're number 1. You know, since 1898 and the Spanish-American War, we've been running everything, basically. And we gotta learn, maybe we can't do that in the same way. Tough lesson. And we're having a hard time learning it, that's my own view. But it also then means, what are we gonna do about the others who are also growing big countries? Look at the numbers of billion-dollar or trillion-dollar economies around. You know, there's a lot more of them. And these are big players. And so what's the new system gonna be? After the Second World War, it was the UN, it was NATO, you know, it was the systems that fundamentally could bring stability. And we finally came to agreement with the Soviets at the Helsinki Agreement. And what did that say? That said, you know, if we try to take each other over, we're gonna destroy each other, so we can't do that. So we're gonna have to live together. Well, you know, maybe with some optimism, we can find a way to do that again, but it's gonna be different than it was in the last century. And we're not gonna have the same role. That's the big problem.
You had a question?
My question builds upon everything else that has been said, and you in part have just answered it. I'm wondering what is happening to America. And that's what you're addressing in some part, because as Putin is pushing his boundaries, looking what his strategies can be, how we're even, as I mentioned earlier to your lovely wife, that we're even changing our attitudes towards deterrence, becoming more climatized and understanding not all nuclear weapons are mass destruction. So what is happening to us? We see what's happening to America. I see how we're sitting back with Ukraine. We have a wait, see, we're doing this much, we no more. What have we as Americans become? And are we marginalized, as you were addressing? We're sitting, waiting, pawns.
I was just gonna say, I'm not sure about marginalized so much. I was thinking maybe we're talking more about a multipolar world rather than just, you know, US versus Russia or this one versus that one too. There just are a lot of places of power. But that isn't exactly the question about what is the US role now in the world. And that is also another good topic for your diplomatic series. What is the US role in the world?
But I would ask you, is there a similarity between the Russian people and the American people? That, again, I keep going back to your experiences in the midst of this society, and really in both societies. Is there any commonality between the people of the two countries, or are we very much separate individual, different cultures?
I would say on the personal level, every time we've been there, and I think everybody who's been there has that sense that one gets along very well one-on-one. The people have, as far as I can recall, have always been, you know, friendly and comfortable with others and not formal the way some European countries have more formal structures and so forth. So just on the one-on-one and friendship side, I think you all had the same experience, didn't you?
Well, when you speak the language fluently enough, you're
That's right.
more or less on an equal level. Yeah. They are a lot like us once you
Right.
speak their language.
Right, I think that's
true in
right.
almost any country.
But that's
Except for
right.
French.
Never speak the language.
That's right. And Russians
Good
are,
accent, though.
Russians are very tolerant, though, of your inability to speak perfectly. At least that's my experience. They were very
But
good
they're
to me.
also very impressed when you can't speak well.
Yes, that's right too. People are very nice about that too. But always on the one-to-one level, I don't think anybody had any issues, you know, just with comfortable friendships. But again, I think
Except
you're
with
right.
KGB.
Yeah, right.
That's a different.
Then you get
that's a-
into the whole official thing, which is yet
But the
another.
FBI is too easy for them to get along with.
That's true.
You don't wanna do that too. I know there's the person that gets the closing.
Right, there's, yes, please.
I was very intrigued by what you said about China, because I think China went through a similar sort of opening up in the 90s, although they seem to have maintained much more control of their society, since it was a controlled opening up rather than just sort of this massive change. But my impression is that the Chinese hate the Russians more than they hate anyone, and always have. And so do you think the Chinese were all receptive to sort of like having sort of a true alliance with Russia that's a long-term thing, as opposed to just a, you know, short-term for the immediate benefit, as long as it benefits China, which is how I think China generally thinks about almost everything in the diplomacy. But you know, Putin acts as though he's in control of that, and I think the Chinese are always in control of that. I mean, but
Well, let
I'm
me
not a
just give you
diplomat.
one
The
story
Chinese
about
get
this.
down on everyone.
Yeah.
After the war in Georgia in the early part of the 2000s, there was a meeting in China of something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is the organization was originally set up to demarcate the border between China and the Soviet Union. But it grew to be even bigger than that. But the point was, they were having a meeting after this, and the Russians pushed the idea that they wanted the two breakaway parts of Georgia to be recognized as independent states. The Chinese said, no way, absolutely not. And that carried the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. About a month later, I had dinner with a very good friend, someone I knew very well. And for the first time, he said something to me I had never heard. He said, you know, we're the second partner.
This person was Russian?
Yeah, this was a Russian. We are now the junior partner with the Chinese.
Yeah.
And so I think there is an understanding of that. And their problem now, including Putin's, is how do I manage that? So they don't remember that there's nobody north of them.
There was a question in the back of the room, and then I'll come to you.
So you've written the book, and thank you for sharing the book. Now you're getting ready to write the segment for the Diplomat the show. What would you highlight?
What would, I didn't even.
What would you highlight for the show?
From your,
You know,
If you were gonna write an episode?
Seeing the show.
Yes.
Everybody says to see it, and you know, every experience I've had with TV or movies is they don't really count, and then I get mad, you see. I watch them and I think, that's not right, that's not right. And so I honestly wish I could say I saw it, but I haven't seen it. What would I write if I were writing a show now? Oh my God, that would be really.
well, in your book, you talk about, and you mentioned it in your talk about the smells.
Yes.
About, and I thought that was very powerful because that seems to be a constant wherever we go.
Right, isn't it?
But you
Yes.
can't capture it on television.
No, you can't. That's one of the problems with TV also.
Well, if you have good actors, they can emote.
After AI, television.
What can be fun though is the, well, cultural contact, and you know, there are some comedies that take that kind of thing on. Somebody coming to a place like, oh, Crocodile Dundee ends up in New York or somewhere like that. You know, you have the experience of somebody, a fish out of water kind of thing. And those can always be funny. I can't write that sort of thing. And that's always exaggerated some way. So I'm not sure whether that would even work, you know, for TV, whether you could do a show about confronting new places. The young man who did the podcast of the book, the YouTube podcast, he's interested in the whole genre of travelers confronting new places. And if you saw the documentary of Gertrude Bell, who, you know, the British Foreign Service officer, I guess, in Arabia, Lawrence's boss, Lawrence of Arabia's boss, I think she was. You get that. What is it like to be foreign, in her case, a woman in the Middle East? Travel accounts are very, very interesting. Somebody confronting a whole new culture. And mostly it's done for laughs, but I think you could do something more serious about that too.
You have a question?
So my question comes to the Russian character that people have
I know, yeah.
talked about it. So one thing I found very interesting is there has never been a rebellion against Putin at a large scale. There's Chechens, you know, Putin gets a little bit of Georgia, a little bit of maybe in the 1939, Russia got a little bit of Finland, and is there part of the people's psyche to rebel against a dictator? Or they're happy to say Putin will be there until 2035 and we are happy living under him?
I think there are nationally held views about the world. I don't know if I think about it as character so much, but when I studied history, what I was mostly interested in is the history of ideas and how the framework that informs people determines what they think about everything. And I was interested in the 17th century because that's when we started getting some of the kind of thinking that shapes America, you know, and that creates America. And it's based on ideas, you know, who the philosophers are, Locke, Montesquieu, and so forth. But I think that's true for all cultures. I think cultures, and this is obviously what anthropologists and sociologists are interested in, what is the cultural belief system? What are the mores? What do they value and not value? And maybe some societies value security. I've had the sense, and I think I've written, that Russians are more apt to value security over wide open chaos, given the choice, you know. It doesn't seem to be in their, you know, that just seems to be in their cultural memory. So, and coming back to the Grand Inquisitor too, you know, mystery, authority, that's, you know, that's what their idea, in the sense their thought system is shaped by. And generation after generation anywhere is going to have that, just as they do in this country. We keep hearing the same words too. There's somebody who's bursting to say something.
I just, you know, never having been there, but witnessed the regular murder of political opposition as the solution political opposition that seems to exist inside of the terrible. That's something that we've never experienced and don't accept as part of society, and it seems to be simply accepted as political solution.
But not uniquely.
Not unique to Russia, but if you were to divide the world into democratic society that no longer accepts it, having a partnership with a country that doesn't accept that.
Yeah, what you get into the question of authoritarianism in countries. I mean, it's 3 centuries or so that the West started thinking, or maybe a little bit before that, where they started thinking nobody's above the law, we're not gonna have absolute leaders and so forth. I mean, again, the revolutions in England, 17th century, that's what I studied. So,
30s in Germany.
Yeah, but once you make that separation, you're in different worlds.
but then some of them change. I mean, Germany is, you know.
Well, no, not by choice.
So, but I would make one thing, there's one character trait that I would say is important in what you raised about organizing, if you will. When you go to Russia and someone says he's my friend, that doesn't mean what it does in the United States. Russians have very few friends as a whole. They are a very small group of people that are almost like your close relatives, more than likely.
And that's a circle you trust.
And this is the circle you really trust. Those are the people on whom you will depend. You will go and you will help them, they will help you. But it is a very limited number of people. Whereas we talk about friends, this is kind of mind, not there. Then there's the vast majority of everybody else, which is neutral. You don't know, you have no idea, but you're not gonna stake very much on it.
You're careful.
You're careful. And then there's the group that you know you don't wanna have anything to do.
We all know who they are.
You know who they are. So that is a very different organizing principle, frankly, for a way you relate to the society around you. So the idea of organizing to, you know, I don't know, get rid of your school principal, it doesn't happen very often.
And for a whole other topic, the American ability to form volunteer associations that Tocqueville identified so long ago, you know, that does not happen in most other places, not just Russia, most other places. So cultural differences, I think that's a wonderful topic also, by the way, cultural differences. That's for another
I'm
day.
gonna ask you, here's one last question. You sure? Yeah, I mean,
If you're trying to wrap
you can make a short one. Before Elizabeth sends us all off to
That's right.
a great evening.
it seems to me like, you know, society that's been immersed with like the secret police, whether that's the KGB or whatever, as one of the organizing principles or one of the organizing foundational aspects of the state, then yeah, you can't trust anybody. But my question is about diplomacy And obviously, there's a long history of American diplomacy, specifically the behind-the-scenes diplomats influencing American policy. I'm thinking about containment with George Kennan after the end of the Second World War. And the question I'm wondering about is, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did you have a clamor, did you have a sense within the diplomatic community that if we downgrade Russia to, you know, the little kids table, right? We just pat them on the head and say, thank you for sharing your feedback, right? Instead of like, so in my mind, I'm like, okay, they're the grizzly bear or whatever the bear is, you know, the real raw animal, the powerful bear, and now they're a teddy bear. And we just pat them on the head and say, thank you for, you know, for being a part of the community of nations, right? And was there a clamor within the diplomatic community that if we don't make Russia feel like we really care about their opinions and we really care about their interests, that this is the path that we might end up on, where if we don't make Russia feel like they matter, then they're gonna make their own reality, they're gonna go their own way.
Well, I mean, look, quite simply, this tended to come out as a debate about NATO. You know, should NATO get expanded or not? Was where the issue was joined, and once that was decided, it was over. And I would submit, the one thing that I thought that was always a problem with Russians is they didn't understand they lost. See, the American view was we were in a war, Cold War, yes, we didn't, you know, we were fighting in various places, but it was a Cold War, and they lost. And then they didn't behave like it.
Conversely, in other words.
Yeah, but you're not saying that's your view.
No, I'm not saying that's my view,
But
but it was the problem of having Americans approach the Russians as anything but ungrateful losers.
Should we have been magnanimous enough?
That will be for part two.
Or pragmatic.
You're pragmatic.
So that will be part two. I think we've got some great topics. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It was wonderful. Appreciate it. Thank you everyone for coming out.